Welcome to CivilNet. We have a very, very special guest here in our studio, Professor Richard Hovannisian. Professor Hovannisian, thank you for joining us.
Thank you.
You are probably one of the most preeminent Armenian scholars of our generation. You are a Professor Emeritus of History at UCLA.
Yes.
You're working with the Shoah Foundation.
I am.
And you have done for Armenian scholarship, I think, I don't know if there's anybody who has done as much as you have, so thank you for that.
To say that.
Thank you for that. We're on the eve of the centennial, 100 years, a lot of events taking place. I don't want to talk right off about the past century necessarily in its legal and political terms. I want to talk about your parents, if we may, with Kaspar and Sirun, who are both survivors of the genocide. And you were born in the United States.
I was, yeah.
And from what I understand, correct me if I'm wrong, you weren't encouraged to speak Armenian as a child growing up. What happened?
Yes and no to all these introductory statements. My mother, in fact, was a survivor in a different sense, in that after the 1909 massacres that took place, her father was apprehensive enough to emigrate to the United States in 1912, 2 years before the genocide. And I was one of the very few families, boys in my generation that had grandparents. Almost no one in my generation had grandparents because they had all remained behind, like my father's parents, and all been killed. So I grew up with a generation without grandparents, and I always say, imagine growing up in your own childhood and not having the love, affection of grandparents that are special, of course. And so my father's, we came from the province of Kharpert. My father's saga was that his father was taken away with all the young men drafted into the army in 1914. And as we later found out, all these Armenians were disarmed, put into labor battalions and worked to death. So, you know, he never came back. And as a matter of fact, my last name, Hovannisian, is a new name my father took after his father was killed. When he came to Ellis Island in 1920 and they asked him, what is your family name? He said Hovannisian because his father's name was Hovhannis. And that's how we became Hovannisian. In any case, he was on those death caravans with all the other villages of Kharpert. There must have been 30 or 40 villages that were all sort of being herded together toward the Euphrates River. With his pregnant mother, his 2-year-old brother. And just by chance, Kurdish tribesmen, you know, they were raiding all the caravans all along the way. And as they raided the caravans, they saw this young boy, 12 or 13, and they took him away because they had sheep and goats, and they needed someone to look after their flocks. And so he became something like slave labor. They treated him very poorly. He had never enough to eat. And then in a saga in 1917, somehow he had heard that Antranik had gotten as far as Erzurum and was able to run away, 16, 17 years old, joining Antranik, taking up arms, imagining a boy who doesn't even know what a weapon is, and then trying to defend himself, ending up in Russia in the Russian Civil War, and then falling back to Constantinople, and then finally immigrating to the United States in 1920. And I tell my students, all of this in a life of a boy at your age when you graduate from high school graduate, this, you know. So this is truly a generation without childhood. Right. They didn't have a childhood. Isn't it? Yes, it is. And you know, when I think about this, and I've done some 800 interviews of survivors, when you said incomprehensible, it was incomprehensible to them. They did not understand what happened to it. They could only sort of essentialize or stereotype, saying, you know, the Turk is bad, the Turkey's always been bad, without trying, you know, they had no means of analysis, understanding the political situation, the mentality of the perpetrators. And so it was incomprehensible. We now, of course, have come to a place in genocide studies where we can understand contextualize the decline of the Ottoman Empire, the rise of nationalism, various other factors that puts us into the mind of the perpetrator and allows us to understand what they were thinking and the fears that they had. But one of the problems of contextualizing, and I tell my colleagues about this, that deal with Armenian history, that we can contextualize, but in no way should we allow justification by saying, the Turks were upset that they had lost all their territories in Europe. They had looking now desperately to save whatever was left, and therefore they had to get rid of the non-Turkic populations. Okay, that's contextualizing it, but in no way justifies.
Absolutely. And I oftentimes try to understand how a young man like your father then is able to come to the United States, get married, raise a family, and lead what I presume on the surface was a normal life. Yeah,
it's amazing.
Was it a normal life?
You know what? I don't know if it was normal. On the surface, it was normal. And indeed, they came as refugees, and that's not only he, his old generation, couldn't speak English, didn't know anything, just through enormous hard labor and determination to overcome the adversity, to create new families. My father didn't talk about the genocide until the very last years of his life when I forced him to in an oral history interview. But even though he didn't talk about it, the genocide was all around us. I tell Jewish audiences, we don't have these special clubs for survivors of the Holocaust, because everybody was a survivor. I grew up with survivors, and I thought I would always be living with them. So it was a different kind of environment that we had with them.
It's almost, it was almost a normal environment, yet a very abnormal environment.
Indeed. I mean, the normalcy, again, talking about survivors, I'm just in awe of them. Because as a child, I remember the parties, they were singing and they were dancing and playing tricks on each other, and the men would play cards and the women would gossip, and it was a family affair. Nobody just was, we all went as families and we did things as family, and just think that this is a generation that could laugh and sing and also cry. Just 10 or 15 years after the horrendous experience that they have. I think, if I had seen my entire family wiped out, my children maybe killed or dying in front of my eyes, or my being forced to abandon a child because I could have 2 children, I could only save one of them, and I had to make these choiceless choices. How could I ever smile again and laugh again? And yet that was this drive. They never forgot. But it was a commitment to make good and to create new families and to defy what they had. But still, never being able to understand what happened, except to say the Turk is evil, the Turk was bad.
Sure, it was a defense mechanism for them, or survival mechanism for them, and perhaps that was the only possible way for.
And the other thing, the survival mechanism for the women, I remember, they all worked. Everybody worked in cannery, and I grew up in California, so it was an agricultural region. And the women work in the fields, picking grapes or whatever they were doing, or in the canneries. My mother worked in canneries where they made preserved fruits. When they would come home, women would gather together. I mean, women from, say, 5 or 6 farms nearby would gather together under a shade tree outside, and they would drink Turkish coffee, as we called it. And as they sat there, they told each other stories. And the stories inevitably went back to the deportations and what they went through. And when you think about it, it was their only kind of therapy that existed for them, because, we didn't have
psychiatrists or
analysts and all the other kinds of things. And so this was how they worked it out, by talking to each other, sometimes laughing, sometimes crying there. So I just am in awe. And I miss that generation very much, because I thought that they would always be with us.
They were special.
And then suddenly, gradually, one by one, they disappeared. And here we are now. And you just sort of feel lost without them. They had such a rich...
you lose your anchor. Right. I suspect that's what it was. Professor Hovannisian, okay, there are many children in the United States whose parents were survivors who have similar stories, because I think that every family, every Armenian family has a similar story. What led you on this path? The passion, the determination, this...
Well, as you, if you've read Family of Shadows, which my grandson Garin wrote, you know that I grew up in a rather a small community of Armenians, just a few families. Because my mother was an immigrant at the age of 3, she was English speaking. And I grew up speaking English, and I never knew how to read or write Armenian until I graduated from university, and then went to Beirut to learn the language. And so, maintaining ethnicity was not encouraged in the United States, 1930s, 1940s. There was a great deal of pressure to assimilate, to forget the old ways, and teachers would scold parents if they spoke Armenian to their children. So I was, you know, we were very insecure and wanted to be accepted by the Anglo outside community. But I was always aware of my Armenianness, even though I was not very secure with it. And like many other kids, I'm sure, whenever there's a book, you look in the index to see the word Armenia, if it's there or not there.
I still do
and it's frequently not there, or if it's there, it's only, you know, the Roman Empire conquered A, B, C, D, and Armenia, which was not satisfying. And so and a sort of also being something of an idealist, a dreamer, and dreaming that wouldn't it be great someday if Armenia were an independent country. And then you meet, you know, I think all of us have that potential. There's a seed there, and it needs to be nurtured. And I met a couple of people in my life, my current wife, who was very involved in it, and then especially the last prime minister of the First Armenian Republic, Hovannisian, who was then the principal of the Armenian Gemaran in Nasham Palanjan Gemaran in Beirut. And he apparently saw something in me. I'm not sure why and what. But he encouraged me to go to Beirut to learn Armenian because he felt that there was something there.
You had
if you didn't, and I could easily have not been nurtured, and I could have just gone on my life, and so those things in one's sort of strategic moments in one's life, and I think those were they. And so when I did learn Armenian, I had the tools to come back to the university and do graduate work on Armenian topics at a time when there were no courses in Armenian history anywhere in the United States. And so we were that generation that created the field. I did my PhD in Russian history and Near Eastern history, but I did my dissertation on the Armenian road to independence.
Right, the First Republic, of which there are now 4 volumes or 5?
The 3 volume was Armenia on the Road to Independence, and then 4 volumes. And after all these years, they're now being translated to Armenian. The 2nd volume, here in Yerevan, there was a book launching, or Shnor Hantes, very recently, and I'm now working on volumes 3 and 4. And I don't wish this on anyone. Translation is the worst possible nightmare, because even people who know the best of
both languages,
if they're not natives to the country, may have difficulty. And I gave this example of, because there's a lot of politics, political activity, like the mandate for Armenia in my volumes. And I say, you know, the Senate tabled the motion. Well, in American English, tabled the motions mean, you know, you put it aside, set it aside. You didn't follow it, but in Armenian, Serani Varaterin, it means that the opposite meaning here. And so I can't expect that my translators would know the idiomatic, and so I have to watch very, very closely.
Sure. It's going to be a monumental
it's a huge undertaking.
You know, it didn't stop with you. Then your son Rafi went on to become the first foreign affairs minister of Armenia, and now your grandson Garin Hovannisian not only wrote the book about your family, he's now co-written and directed 1915, the movie, which will be premiered in Yerevan on April 25. You know, oftentimes in our own experience, we see that when a father or a mother is very, very involved in community affairs and Armenian affairs, it somehow skips a generation, and it didn't skip any generation.
There's a lot of resentment among children of very strong activists because they feel that they've been deprived of a parent's attention, affection, doing things together. And I've seen quite a number of that kind of child. And in my case, I guess we were fortunate. My children never went to an Armenian school, and yet I had the drive, and my wife had the drive that we would force them, and they weren't very happy maybe, but after school we would sit with them for an hour or two of Armenian, and when my children spoke to me in English, I would say Chem Haskanar, until, I'm not sure that's good either psychologically, but it was the only way that I could compel them to speak Armenian. And so Rafi's generation was different from my generation. They were already comfortable being Americans. They didn't have any sense of insecurity. They could, and as I, in my own later life, was able to do certainly, to flow back and forth between one language and another, one culture and another. And that gives you a great, sense of not only security, of enrichment. That you can enjoy the cultures and the languages and so forth. And I think that generation grew up with that security. They went on, they became lawyers and doctors and engineers, and to the degree that they wanted to maintain their Armenian identity, they could do so. And also we lived in an America that was somewhat different, that began to at least externally embrace multiculturalism. I say externally because I'm not sure that how sincere that is and how deep it is. And then you're right that his son's generation also continued, which is unusual because he's now the fourth generation American Armenian, and as we know, most fourth generation American Armenians have already lost the language and have what they retain by the fourth generation is normally the Armenian dance and Armenian food.
But interestingly, one phenomenon that we've witnessed here is that it's the fourth generation that embraces Armenia wholeheartedly, more than the third generation and certainly more than the second generation. We see a younger Garin's generation who accept Armenia and seem to intrinsically understand, something which we have difficulty with, understand that it is a new country and it is facing challenges, and they are more open to it than.
Well, that's why I always say, we as adults have a lot to criticize about Armenia, the administration, the economy, and so forth. Setting our kids or grandkids here at a very early age is so important because they really fall in love with the land and they don't see all the negative aspects of it. This is Armenia. This is our country. And they fall in love with every tree and every town and every church.
Maybe it's the idealism.
And I think if we were able to bring all of the Armenian diaspora and children to Armenia, not necessarily Yerevan, but somewhere in Armenia, over a couple of weeks, a month, a summer, you would find a great strengthening of our communities. The irony, of course, is that when you bring them all together, they can't speak to each other because they speak Spanish and they speak French and they speak English. But I think our challenge is to create among all of those an elite, I'm not saying in a negative way, an elite of leaders who are able to communicate. And I think someone like Garin now, who is a fourth generation, who can speak, who can read and write Armenian, and we have some individuals like that in other countries. They need to be sort of the leaders of trying to bring all of this together.
Absolutely. Now, we must return back to the question of genocide, because it is that year that was anticipated. It's just a number after all, but it is a number. And,
it is a number.
And as humans, I think that's what we do. We look at numbers.
Yeah, it's a round number.
It's a round number. Galortiv, as they say. It shaped, the past 100 years shaped a collective national consciousness.
Yeah.
With all of my guests, I've been asking the question, what is going to happen on April 25? What is the path forward? And what as a nation that has been a victim of one of the greatest crimes against humanity, what can we do to somehow not necessarily change the narrative, but enrich the narrative?
Well, to be honest, I don't know if the Armenian question will ever be solved. I don't know if the Armenians will ever get anything in compensation for the enormous loss, not only of life, but the basic foundations of creating, maintaining a culture, a cultural continuity. I mean, here I am. I can't go beyond my great-grandparents. I don't know who they were because everything was destroyed. And the people who knew, I didn't think to ask when they were there. But you know, we are seeing at least some movement in the last years. Whether that will really come to any kind of fruition, I don't know. But I think we're really the first step that binds all Armenians in a negative way, but nonetheless unavoidable, is this anger and outrage at denial. And if the perpetrator's side were smart, it would stop denying. And it would take at least the symbolic steps that could assuage, soften the blow, and to allow us, who are the descendants of the victims, to escape a kind of emotional imprisonment in which we find ourselves. You know, we either become obsessed with it, or we say, I don't want to be an Armenian anymore, you know, I want to go away, I have one life to live, why should I, you know, worry about all of this? And that both of these are victimization. And so if we could at least get to a point where denial is terminated, and in its place, instead of having Talat Pasha Street and so forth in Istanbul, to have Armenian memorials throughout all the areas where Armenians had lived, where the Turkish textbooks would no longer go into denial, but try to analyze what the Young Turk government did and understand the evils of it. In other words, at least to set the record straight. That doesn't satisfy everyone. It does satisfy a significant portion of the diaspora and youth that really doesn't want to go back, you know, doesn't want to leave the land in which it lives. But it's a beginning. And beyond that, the perpetrator side has to take some kind of compensatory or actions or some actions to show feelings of contrition, that they realize they did wrong, maybe just symbolically. It's not the money anymore. Nobody really needs that money, but it has the significance, a particular significance in the way that the United States government, after many, many decades, finally admitted that it was wrong to relocate the Japanese American population from the West Coast in World War II, offered them reparations. And again, the Japanese community is very successful, doesn't need that money, but it was important to that community to say, because it was an admission on the part of a government that it had done wrong and tried to rectify it. When I go to Germany, I'm just absolutely astounded. Memorials to the Holocaust in the heart of Berlin, I mean, near the Brandenburg Gate, huge. And in every city and town I go to, Jewish museums, plaques about where the cemeteries were. And not in our case, not in our case. So in many ways, the Armenian Genocide was the most severe in the sense that an iron curtain came down between our historic homelands and ourselves, the survivors and ourselves. Even legally, the Turkish government passed laws that, based on security, they prevented Armenians from going anywhere into the eastern provinces, including even Istanbul Armenians who were Turkish citizens. And so that divide has been maintained. That also does not allow us to acknowledge all the good Turks there were at the time, because nearly every story of a survivor has some form of intervention. In my father's case, it wasn't altruistic, it wasn't for good purpose, it was to exploit. But in other cases, there were some people who were truly sheltered and hidden for whether it was one day or 1 week or 1 year, for some time. So we need to try to find a way to crawl out of this emotional prison that we've been placed in, not because of any of our own fault, but because of those who perpetrated it. And hopefully, both governments and in Turkey a growth of civil society might eventually, certainly not in my lifetime, but maybe sometime in the foreseeable future, might bring the Turkish government to a point where it not only says, my condolences to the descendants of the victims in a shared suffering, as they would call it, in a shared suffering, but actually come to a point and say, yeah, maybe it's better. Because even governments that are complicit in the denial, including the United States government, knows what the truth is, and they're not happy being a part of the denial. Collectively, external pressure, internal civil society might bring us to a new stage, people won't like to hear me say this, but I'm not optimistic that there will be territorial restitution. I wish there were. I wish that mountain were on our side. Maybe that's something you could strive for.
Yeah, symbolically.
Yeah, right.
I oftentimes say
that could be a part of the symbolic restitution. Give you Ani back, which is right on the other bank of the
right before our
river.
Eyes.
Right before our eyes is Ararat. So again, I think it is incumbent upon Armenian leadership, whatever that is, and right now I would say it has to be a government, to determine how to get us out of this prison. What are our demands? How do we define them, sahmanel in Armenian? And what are the different stages? I mean, when anyone goes to the negotiation, they go there with their maximal demands, and they know they're not going to get their maximal demands. But there are fallback positions. How far can you fall back without saying, no, I'm not, I'm walking away from the table? I don't think we've ever come to that. I remember with Mr. Voskanyan, who was the foreign minister, I raised that point, and I've raised it with others as well, that we need to have a national agenda and determination. The diaspora cannot make these decisions. The diaspora can contribute to these decisions because there is no common agreement among diaspora. And Armenia, fortunately, now has a government, and it's incumbent upon that government to take the lead and not be afraid to take the lead.
Well, hopefully you can encourage them.
I try.
Professor Hovannisian, thank you so much. We can certainly talk, if not for hours, for days. Thank you.
And the motto is a good motto, Gehishem Gebahanshem, and it's important to remember. Memory is very important. Memory is a part of the struggle. And someone said that the struggle against power is the struggle of memory against forgetting. And that's what we're here for. That's what we're here for. And the demands need to be formulated in a clear and straightforward fashion, I think.
So the struggle continues. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
And I'd like to remind our viewers that my guest was Professor Richard Hovannisian. Stay with CivilNet.